Artemi Panarin could be heading into his final season as a New York Ranger. We are talking about what the future holds between the Blue Shirts and the Breadman.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1355 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Schick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So today we bring back a off-season series that we do. We've done it pretty much every year ever since Locked On New York Rangers came into existence. We basically just take a look at the projected roster for the New York Rangers for the upcoming season. We take a look at each individual player, and we go through everything that could possibly happen to that player within reason for the upcoming campaign. And we take a look at their best case scenarios and their worst case scenarios. And today we're going to kick off that off-season series, that annual off-season series with the Breadman, Artemi Panarin. And as we typically do, we're going to start with the bad stuff, take a look at the worst case scenarios for Artemi Panarin, then we'll get to the best case scenarios for Panarin, and at the end, just kind of some final thoughts and also, kind of a verdict and just kind of a season outlook for Panarin. And like I said, we'll do this with every player. The star players will get their own episode. Role players, we might put a few of them into all the same episode, but you get the idea of what we're doing here. And at the end, also going to have some thoughts on tomorrow's Shoulder Check Showcase in Stamford, Connecticut. I will be attending, so if you're there, definitely feel free to come and say hi. But for right now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and kick off, like I said, this off-season series. We are taking a look at the worst-case scenarios of Artemi Panarin. I think in a worst-case scenario for the Breadman, he does not get a new contract before the season, and it becomes at least something of a distraction going into the season. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of sports cliches. I try to stay as far away from them as possible when we do this show here together. But this one I feel like has at least some merit. Panarin's been with the Rangers for a long time. He's going into year 7, if you can possibly believe that. It is the 7th and final year of the contract that he signed when he joined the Rangers as a free agent so many years ago. Look, my viewpoint on Panarin and his contract and where everything stands and how the Rangers should approach it has not changed. Let me just explain that really quickly here. I think the best approach, and we'll have some more detailed thoughts on this a little bit later in today's show, but I think the best approach for the Rangers is to just kind of hold with Artemi Panarin. See how the season goes, see how Panarin does, and see where the Rangers stack up with the rest of the NHL when we get to the trade deadline. If the Rangers are in a situation where they're contending, then by all means, you keep Artemi Panarin through that deadline. And maybe at that point, you're even talking about a contract extension. If the Rangers are not contending, you go to Panarin about waiving the no-move clause, and you see if you can make something happen and get a king's ransom for, probably a guy who would be the best player available at this year's trade deadline, if he indeed is available at this year's trade deadline. But what's interesting to me about this entire scenario is we don't really know which way Artemi Panarin is leaning, and that might be by design on the behalf or on the part of both Panarin as well as his agent. They don't want to, tip their hand too much. But I have not gotten, I don't know Panarin personally, obviously, but I have not gotten even the smallest inclination of like Panarin wants to stay, or he just wants to play this last year and then he'll leave in free agency, or he'd like to be traded, or he wants to be extended. I have no idea. I haven't really been able to get a feel for that. And a lot of this is, going by different reports around the NHL. I haven't seen a beat writer or an NHL reporter that's really weighed in on that as far as where Panarin is and what he's looking to do. So that's kind of interesting in its own right. My best guess is that Panarin, everything else being equal, would choose to stay with the New York Rangers. He has obviously thrived here. He's had a ton of success here. He seems to enjoy the bright lights and whatnot. And I mean, this is home for him, right? He's been here for the last 6 years. So I would think if all 32 teams offered the exact same contract to Panarin, I would think he would probably stay with the Rangers, but I just don't know that that's going to happen. And how important is money to Panarin? How important is the length of his next contract? How important is it for him to go to a place where he can win? Does he think he can still win with the Rangers? Does he think he can get a Stanley Cup with the Rangers? All these are questions that we don't know the answers to, but I think it's very interesting to think about. But the bottom line, in a worst case scenario, the fact that he does not have a contract that will kind of like linger into the season for Panarin and kind of be in the back of his head, once the season begins. I think also in a worst case scenario, you're looking at a situation where age catches up. And this one is pretty self-explanatory, but Panarin will be 34 in October. I'm not too worried as far as like his offensive production falling off of a cliff in this upcoming season. I'm not too worried about, injuries or anything. Panarin's been a very durable player. He has played in 244 out of a possible 246 games in the last 3 seasons combined. And obviously he's played in every playoff game during that time as well. The only reason why you worry about the age a little bit is the very simple fact that Father Time is undefeated, and sooner or later, professional athletes, no matter how great they are, they do start to decline. I mean, it's just inevitable, and Panarin's no exception to that rule. But for the time being, that's why I think you might be a little bit worried about a contract extension for Panarin, because you now are getting into his mid to late 30s, and how much longer can he keep going like this? At what point will he not be worth, the cap hit that he's getting? And we don't know what his new contract would look like. But eventually, yes, he will get to a point where he does start to slow down a little bit. But for this upcoming season, not too worried about it. I think also in a worst case scenario, the Rangers have a bad season again, and they're in a position to be sellers at the deadline, and they end up dealing him at the deadline, because that would be it as far as Panarin with the Rangers. I know there's some people that are going to throw out the idea of, well, you could trade Panarin at the deadline, right? And then you could re-sign him in free agency the following year. Technically, yes, there's nothing really stopping that, but when does that ever happen? There aren't too many examples really in sports of that happening. And I'm not talking about somebody having 2 different tenures with the same team. That happens, quite frequently, or at least somewhat frequently. But it doesn't really go like that. There's never a situation where somebody gets dealt at the trade deadline and then re-signs with that same team that traded them the following offseason. It's very rare. New York sports, the one example I can throw out there is Aroldis Chapman all those years ago, traded to the Cubs and then re-signs with the Yankees in the offseason. But I can't even think of an example of that with the Rangers off the top of my head here. Maybe you guys have 1 or 2 in mind, but as far as being traded at the deadline and then re-sign the following year, yeah, I'm coming up empty. I would have to dive a little bit deeper into that, but that would be the end of it. And the even worst case scenario here, to kind of build on that, kind of like a part 2 of this one, is the Rangers are bad this season, and they get to the trade deadline, and they're looking to trade Panarin, and for whatever reason, Panarin decides, no, I don't want to waive my no move clause. That would really be a problem. That would be a disaster. Now, I would think if the Rangers aren't contending, like say they're like buried, like they're not going to make the playoffs, they're 10 or more points down. And I don't think that's going to happen. But if it does, the Rangers are in that situation and Panarin just doesn't want to waive the no move clause. There's nothing the Rangers can do. You're in another lost season. You're not going to go to the playoffs, but you have this very valuable trade chip that you cannot move. That's a complete catastrophe right there. And again, I don't think the Rangers will be in that situation. And if they are, I get the feeling Panarin will be open to a trade at that point in the season, but I can't say that for sure. And that to me is probably the ultimate worst case scenario with Panarin this upcoming season. We'll throw out one more here, another worst case scenario for Panarin. The Rangers make the playoffs, but they go out quickly and we get another subpar Artemi Panarin playoff performance. Now, I don't think Panarin has been as dreadful in the playoffs as certain Ranger fans might have you believe. The one season that really stands out is, let's see, this would now be 3 seasons ago when the Rangers went down in the first round of the Devils and Panarin had all of 2 assists in the 7 games, basically just invisible. He has had good playoff showings other than that. Are they quite on par with what he does in the regular season? No, they're not. And there's been times where I think it's been fair to wonder if Panarin's style in the regular season can translate to the playoffs. But I do think the Rangers' most recent run in the playoffs, that being 2 years ago when they made it to the conference final and lost to Florida, I think Panarin adjusted his game at least a little bit and was able to play a better brand of playoff hockey. He was almost a point-per-game player, but even more importantly, I felt like he was doing a little bit more of the dirty work that you just have to do in the playoffs. We saw him in the corner at times fighting for pucks. There was one instance where he absolutely just destroyed TJ Oshie with an open ice hit in the first round against the Caps. So I think Panarin was a little bit more willing to play, a playoff style of hockey. Or it's not even just a willingness. It's more of just like an awareness. Like, okay, it's the playoffs. I got to adjust what I'm doing out here at least a little bit. Honestly, I feel like at times it's been indecisiveness for Panarin in the playoffs that's hurt him more than like a lack of physicality or anything like that. But be that as it may, I think in a worst case scenario, Like that's going to be a rough way to go out for if you're Artemi Panarin. If the Rangers make it to the playoffs, they lose in the first round in 5 games, and you get like 2 points, a lot of people are going to remember that, and that's kind of like a very unceremonious end of your Ranger tenure. That would be a really rough way, I think, for the Panarin era with the Rangers to end. Excuse me. But we'll in just a minute, we're going to switch the page. We're going to take a look at the good stuff, the best case scenarios for Artemi Panarin for this upcoming season, including the return of the Panarin bump or the hopeful return of the Panarin bump. And we will get to all that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with your friends or your family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize that you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last-minute tickets without all the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes it all possible. Gametime makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to the first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. There are seat views in the app right before you buy, so you know exactly where you'll be and what you're looking at when you get to the venue. That is probably my favorite app on Gametime. It's just awesome. I want to see what I'm going to see once I get to the venue for a game, a concert, whatever it might be. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, so we discussed the not so good scenarios for Artemi Panarin, the worst case scenarios that could possibly befall the Breadman this upcoming season. Now it's time to move on to the best case scenarios for Artemi Panarin. But first, let me just give a big shout out to the everydayers. Thank you guys as always for supporting this podcast throughout the entire season, the entire regular season, the postseason, the preseason, the whole 9 yards, everything. Bottom line, in our next episode, you're going to want to stick around for that because we're going to be talking about the Shoulder Check Showcase, which is a charity game that's going to be played in Stamford, Connecticut tomorrow, Thursday. And then we'll have the episode out on Friday and discuss everything that happens there and just, everything that night means to everybody and everybody that shows up, all the highlights from the game. It's going to be a lot of fun. So definitely looking forward to that. But for right now, the best case scenarios for Artemi Panarin for this upcoming season. And the first one that popped into my head as soon as I started making the bullet points for this episode is going to be the return of the Panarin bump. This is something that I started talking about with Artemi Panarin right at the start of his Ranger career because it became very, very apparent that not only is this guy a superstar player and just a phenomenal talent, but he makes everybody around him better. You can put just about any type of forward onto a line with Panarin and he'll figure out a way to make it work. Doesn't matter if it's a homegrown guy, free agent signing, somebody who's big, somebody who's small, somebody who's a sniper, somebody who's a little bit more of a playmaker, somebody who's going to do the grunt work, old, young, it doesn't matter. Anybody that plays with Artemi Panarin immediately reaps the benefits from it. But we didn't see quite as much of that this past season. You look at his line mates, or at least the two guys that spent more time with Panarin than anybody else. And in my estimation, that was Vincent Trocheck and Alexis Lafreniere. We'll start with Trocheck. So Trocheck, 2 years ago, career season, had 77 points in 82 games. This past season drops to just 59 points in 82 games. So we didn't quite see the Panarin bump there, and it was the same thing for Lafreniere. Lafreniere went from 57 points in 82 games 2 years ago to just 45 points in 82 games this past year. So not quite as much of a drop for Lafreniere. And let me also say, look, Artemi Panarin is not solely responsible for the production of his line mates, right? If Trocheck took a step back last year and Lafreniere took a step back last year, which by every measure they did, I mean, that falls on them first and foremost. But we're used to having this luxury. We're used to being spoiled when it comes to Artemi Panarin because he is able to elevate everybody around him. You put somebody on a line with Artemi Panarin, the production goes way up. And we saw that 2 years ago with both Trocheck and Lafreniere. Didn't quite see it as much this past season. But I've always said, for all the accolades that Panarin has received and the all-stars and all these points and all these amazing goals and, the playoff Game 7 overtime winner. The biggest thing that Artemi Panarin has done, in my very humble estimation, while he's been a New York Ranger, is elevate players around him. We've seen it from everybody from, we just mentioned Trocheck, we mentioned Lafreniere. Before that, it was guys like, Ryan Strome, Jesper Fast, Andrew Kopp. He was only here for half a season, but man, did the two of them click. Kopp was scoring at a clip that he's never scored at before or since in his NHL career. Small sample size, sure, but that small sample size was with Artemi Panarin, and I don't think that is a coincidence at all. So best case scenario for me, the return of the Panarin bump. And another best case scenario here, again, this one's sort of going to be a part 2 of what we just talked about, which would, of course, be the Panarin bump. What about a Panarin bump for one of the really, really young forwards on this Ranger team, one of the homegrown big-time prospects? And, of course, I'm talking mostly about Gabe Perreault, Brian Hoffman, and Brett Berard. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all 3 of those players that I just mentioned, they have to make the team for starters. There's no guarantee that all 3 of them are going to be on the opening night roster, so there's that to consider as well. The other thing here is that to start this upcoming season, I do prefer Panarin being back with Trocheck and Lafreniere. Let's see if those 3 can recapture the magic that they showed as recently as 2 seasons ago when they were legitimately one of the best and most productive lines in the entire NHL. But we know that stuff is always subject to change. What we see on opening night is not what we're going to see in Game 82. It's not what we're going to see in the playoffs if the Rangers can get there. So with that in mind, sooner or later, I feel like eventually Artemi Panarin is going to be on the same line as one of those young players that I just mentioned, whether it's Perreault, whether it's Berard, whether it's Hoffman. Now, the other thing to consider here is that Perreault is the only natural right winger in that bunch. And obviously Panarin plays the left wing. Brent Hoffman plays the left wing. Brett Berard plays the left wing. So you'd have to kind of reconfigure things a little bit if you wanted, say, Hoffman to be on the same line as Panarin. I would imagine Hoffman would move to the right side. But there's always ways to do that. The Rangers have shown in recent years that they're not too shy about, moving a left wing to right wing or moving a center to right wing, whatever it might be. There have been plenty of examples of that over the years. But man, what an accomplishment it would be for Panarin, and potentially even a parting gift for this New York Ranger franchise if he can elevate one of those young players, Perreault, Hoffman, Berard, to a whole nother level and essentially turn them into stars as soon as this upcoming season. That's been absolutely massive for Panarin. And I think what he brings to the table with the New York Rangers is his ability to do exactly that. And it's one thing to do it with guys like Trocheck or Lafreniere, but to get somebody's career off the ground, I mean, Panarin should look at that like a challenge, right? Like he should be able to, he tried to take on that challenge years ago with Vitaly Kravtsov, but I don't think anybody was really going to get a whole lot of anything out of Kravtsov. So with that being the case, here's the new challenge. Try to elevate Hoffman, Perreault, or Berard if there is a situation where Panarin ends up playing with at least one of those players this upcoming season. I think also in a best case scenario for Artemi Panarin, he revitalizes the Ranger rush. When you look at last season, I don't think there were too many teams in the NHL that struggled defending the rush more so than the Rangers did, but they weren't a whole lot better in scoring off the rush in its own right. They weren't good on either end of that spectrum. And when you look at as recently as 2 years ago, I mean, when you had Panarin and you had Trocheck and you had Lafreniere flying into the offensive zone, crisscrossing, doing all these things, defenders looked overwhelmed. They looked like they didn't know how to stop this, especially if Panarin had the puck. And I think that the Rangers are going to start scoring some of these explosive goals, start scoring off the rush again, start scoring just some exciting goals. We didn't see a whole lot of that this past season. You're going to see Artemi Panarin leading the way there. He's going to have to be the guy that's kind of quarterbacking the rush, and he's going to be the guy that when he's got the puck on his stick, okay, he's dangerous. Defenders kind of gravitate toward him, and he's such a great passer. He's got his teammate wide open on the other side of the ice. He'll put it right on the tape, and they'll start scoring again. But I think if the Rangers are going to fix their issues on the rush, I mean, again, they got to figure out how to defend the rush first and foremost. I think that's probably even more important than scoring off of the rush again. But if they're going to start doing that again, I think Artemi Panarin needs to be one of the guys leading the charge when it comes to that aspect of the game. I think also in a best case scenario, more shooting from Artemi Panarin. 2 years ago, I don't know if it was pressure from all of us or if he was coached to do it this way, but Artemi Panarin finally began to take advantage of one of the greatest assets that he possesses as a player, and that is his deadly accurate shot. At the age of 32, and keep in mind, he's been in the NHL for about a decade at this point, He put 303 shots on goal. His previous career high before that was 228 shots on goal. And naturally, he ends up with a career high 49 goals. We had some comments from Henrik Lundqvist a few years back where, he talks about players that he faced in practice, teammates going up against teammates and whatnot. He said Artemi Panarin has the most accurate shot of any teammate that he's ever gone up against. And he might have even said anybody that he's ever actually played. And we know Panarin's such a great passer, and we know he's very selfless out there, and he wants to set up his buddies to score goals and everything, and I get that. I mean, he's great at that too. But you can't not use something that's as deadly of a weapon as Panarin's shot. You just can't. So I want to see him start shooting the puck more. Case in point, I just mentioned 2 years ago, he went to a career high 303 shots on goal. This past year dropped down to just 237 shots on goal. Still the second highest total of his career, mind you, but a far, far drop off from what we saw the season before that. So give me Artemi Panarin sniping the puck more often. I think that will certainly pay dividends for the New York Rangers because he's got a deadly accurate shot. I think also in a best case scenario, if the Rangers make the playoffs, we get playoff Panarin. And playoff Panarin is the guy that we saw 2 years ago when the Rangers ended up in the conference final against the Panthers. And I know there's going to be some people that take a look at what happened that year in the playoffs and they look at the Panther series and what happened there? Where was he against the Panthers? We needed him there. You're not wrong. You're completely correct about that. But you also have to appreciate the opponent that you're going up against there. And you can't use that as a complete excuse, but facts are facts. The Panthers in the last 3 seasons combined are now 11-1 in playoff series. And we've seen them shut down star player after star player after star player. Again, Panarin still needed to be better in that series, as did many of his teammates. But facts are facts. I mean, the Panthers have emphatically shut down star players. And before that, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think that Panarin was playing just a more playoff brand type of hockey. There was a little bit more physicality. There was a little bit more dirty work from Artemi Panarin, a little bit more of a willingness to get to those high danger scoring areas rather than playing along the perimeter. I think Panarin improved. It wasn't perfect, but he improved in a way that he needed to be successful in the playoffs, 2 seasons ago. So if the Rangers get back to the playoffs and Panarin's still there, that's what I want to see from him once the postseason begins. And one more best case scenario for Artemi Panarin before we, kind of have a verdict and some final thoughts at the end of this. If he does resign, it is a reasonable cost and length. And honestly, it's very difficult to say what that even means now because you've got this salary cap that's been rapidly rising every year. And I think that's certainly a good thing for several different reasons. But I don't know. I mean, what's a fair contract for Panarin? Do you do a 3-year extension at $8 million a season? Is that too high? Do you go to 4 years and bring the average annual value down a little bit, maybe to $7.5 million per season? Again, and a lot of this is going to depend on what Panarin wants and what his priorities are and how much he wants to continue being a New York Ranger. There's other things to consider too. I don't want to miss out on one of the much younger free agents that are going to be available in next year's draft class because they're paying too much money to Artemi Panarin, who's getting into his mid to late 30s by the end of the contract. But be that as it may, I'm still open to an extension for Panarin, but it's just got to be at the right cost and the right length. We'll see how it goes. In just a second, going to have some final thoughts on Panarin, sort of a verdict, a season outlook for him. And I do want to say a couple things about the Shoulder Check Showcase, which will be happening, like I said, tomorrow in Stamford, Connecticut. And we will do all of that in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers with a verdict, some final thoughts on Artemi Panarin, the season outlook for Artemi Panarin. Despite him only having 1 year left on his deal, I still do think that this guy is the most important player on the New York Rangers, not named Igor Shesterkin. And comparing skaters and goalies, it's always a little bit of apples and oranges anyway. But you're talking about a guy that has led this team in scoring for all 6 seasons that he's been here. And I don't know that it's ever really been all that close. I would have to go and look back at all the history books here and all the different, seasons from over the years with the Rangers since Panarin has been here. But he's always been the guy. He's always been the guy that's making things happen. He's always been the guy elevating his teammates. And he needs to be here to play out this final season of his contract because, as we've discussed on here, everything that the Rangers have done in the past year or so, all signs point to an aggressive retool rather than a full-fledged tear-down rebuild. And as I've mentioned in the past, we can discuss whether that's the right way to go, whether they should be completely rebuilding everything and trading everybody and everything that's not nailed down. You could certainly make that argument, but the Rangers have dug in. They want to do the quick fix. They want to get everything back on track for this upcoming season. You start with the acquisition of JT Miller this past year. You move on from veterans who you feel, just aren't working out anymore. Guys like Trouba, guys like Kreider. I know there's some people that are upset about that. I understand it. But everything they're doing is pointing to this team doing an aggressive retooling. Even like a more recent thing, like the signing of Vladislav Gavrikov. I mean, I realize he got a long contract, so it's at least possible that the Rangers could do a contract like that, looking to contend in the second half of said contract. But I don't think that's what they're doing here. I think they're trying to improve their team as much as they possibly can so that they can contend for this upcoming season. And if you do all these things, why then would you trade the guy who very likely is going to be your best forward for this upcoming season? Trade him for what? First of all, full no move clause. Full no move clause. I know there's going to be some people that say, well, you can get him to waive it. You can get him to do this. You can always work around it. Yes and no. I mean, yes, I guess there might be a way that you could convince Artemi Panarin to waive the no move clause. I don't think he's going to do it right now, though. And that's in his contract. If you don't like it, I understand that. But I think we all have to at least respect it, that was the agreement that was agreed upon. And he has every right to stay here if that's what he wants to do. Secondly, let me also mention this. If the Rangers get to the trade deadline and they're not contending, then I will be firmly in the camp of trading Artemi Panarin, because at that point, yes, you can get a lot for him. But again, it all comes down to whether he's willing to waive that no move clause or not. So there's that to consider as well. But again, like you want to trade him right now. Okay, what do you want to trade Artemi Panarin for? And again, keep in mind, this is not a rebuilding team. They are not rebuilding. They are retooling. So any trade that you do involving Panarin, you have to come out of it making this Ranger team better. What is that trade? And I've mentioned this in the past too. I hate to burst everybody's bubble here, but no, the Ottawa Senators are not going to trade us Brady Tkachuk for Artemi Panarin. And they're not going to do it even if we throw in, I don't know, Adam Sakura or like Urho Vakanainen. It's not going to happen, okay? They're not moving him. That's their captain. They're building something good there. They have literally zero incentive to do anything like that. Besides that, I mean, what other like marquee superstar player? Like if you want to do a 1-for-1 trade involving Artemi Panarin, who's the superstar that's coming back in the other direction? The only one that I could like possibly see there being any chance, and honestly, even this doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I'll throw it out there because why not? Let's just have some fun here. Jason Robertson. We talked about him and the idea that the Dallas Stars could be looking to trade him at some point because they think they might not be able to afford him in the long term. So, okay, 1-for-1. Again, let's just get a little crazy here. Let's just throw it out. Panarin for Robertson, 1-for-1. Why would the Stars do that? Panarin's only got 1 year left on his deal. I mean, I guess you could argue that's kind of like an all-in move for the Stars to win it this year. It's a team that's obviously been close in recent seasons, but, they're giving away a superstar too. So there's that. But beyond that, like, even if the Stars can't afford Jason Robertson after this year, Robertson next offseason will be an RFA with arbitration rights. At that point, they can trade him for a whole bunch of assets. Things that are probably cumulatively better than just one season of Artemi Panarin. That's the only one where there's any kind of like Hail Mary attempt as far as like a 1-for-1 superstar trade, but I just don't think it's in the cards. I just don't see it making really a whole lot of sense for the Stars. But we'll see. As far as like what I'd like to see with Panarin this upcoming season, touch on this very briefly in the last section, but once again, give me that trio of Panarin, Trocheck, and Lafreniere to start this upcoming season. I am willing to give them, probably being a little too nice here, I am willing to give them, though, something of a mulligan for everything that happened this past season, for the entire line cumulatively taking a giant step backward. And the reason I'm somewhat willing to do this is they are just 2 years removed, like I said, from being one of the best lines in the entire NHL. So let's give them a chance to get back to that level. There are no other obvious line combinations that the Rangers absolutely like must go with where you have to break these guys up. So with that being the case, let's give them one more shot together. Let's see if they can hit the ground running and kind of rediscover some of that magic that we saw from this line 2 seasons ago. I'm certainly willing to see the Rangers do that. And I mean, they haven't asked for my opinion, but you get the idea. On top of that, I'd also like to see, just in general, a line become the go-to line following or during the shift that follows a goal. We talked about last season how much of an issue it was whenever the Rangers would give up a goal or whenever they would score one on their own. That next shift was always very shaky. It was a shift where you were often holding your breath, and it was a shift where the Rangers were often giving up goals. With that being the case, the Rangers absolutely must identify a go-to line for this upcoming season in the shift that follows a goal. And I'd like to see Artemi Panarin kind of leading the charge there. Just put your best players on the ice. There's part of me that would think like, maybe JT Miller would be good to go out there because he's not going to take a shift off. He'll be out there in the shift that follows a goal. Or you can go with the fourth liners. They can get the puck deep and just kind of go to work on the forecheck and wear guys down and whatnot. But you know what, man? Sometimes you got to lean on your stars. Artemi Panarin is the biggest star on the New York Rangers, and I'd like to see him in his line kind of take the bull by the horns on the shift that follows a goal and get right back in there on the attack. Or if nothing else, at least don't give up any quality scoring chances in the shift that follows a goal, like the Rangers did countless times this past season. So that's another idea. And again, I'm going to double down on this. I think the Rangers need to go into this season without an extension in place for Artemi Panarin, but it's one of those things where depending on how things go, depending on how next year's free agent class is looking and how many guys re-sign with their current team and how many don't, you can eventually, if there's not going to be any better options, then maybe you talk to Artemi Panarin about an in-season contract extension. But I think the best thing to do is wait until the trade deadline and see where things stand there. So we'll call it there. There is one more thing that I want to talk about, though, and that is the third annual Shoulder Check Showcase. It is happening tomorrow, Thursday, at Terry Connors Ice Rink in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm going to be there for the third consecutive year, so it's been an honor to be there and be like a welcome guest of everybody in charge of this event. Essentially, it is a charity hockey game that is dedicated to making sure that nobody ever feels alone. It is dedicated to the late Hayden Thorson, who tragically took his own life, several years ago. And it brings out a lot of good in people. That place is not a very big hockey rink. It's a decent size, but it's certainly no Madison Square Garden. But that place is always packed to the rafters. It's always got different star NHL players from around the league that are going to show up. There's a whole bunch of Rangers that are going to be there this year. Adam Fox, Matt Rempe, Brett Berard. Jonathan Quick is actually going to be one of the coaches with Marty St. Louis. Quick played in the game last year and actually had a heck of a game. I've also seen a couple of websites. I saw their Instagram page that said that Gabe Perreault and Drew Fortescue were going to be there as well. But then I got the email the other day and those names weren't included. So I don't know. They might be there. We'll see. But either way, a bunch of superstar players. I mean, guys like Trevor Zegras, he's going to be there. Jake Ottinger, Frank Vetrano, our old friend now with the Ducks. Kreider's going to be there. Obviously, he's now on the Ducks as well. So technically, this is going to be Kreider's first hockey game since the Rangers traded him. So that's going to be quite the sight in its own right. But very much looking forward to going there. Going to get there, a little bit early. And if you're going to be there, let me know. Leave a comment in the YouTube comment section here. Leave a comment. I'll definitely see it there on the YouTube comment section. And definitely come and say hi. Would love to meet some of you guys if anybody's planning on attending. But we'll call it there. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I will see you next time.